Hello and good morning, everybody. Thanks for attending today's panel session. Hello to the panelists. I'll get around to introduction shortly. Today's panel session is on Deconstructing Fit-out. Is greater collaboration a pipe dream? Brought to you today by MBS as usual, but also in collaboration with our new trade partner, FIS. I'm Lee Jones, Head of Manufacturer Solutions here at the MBS, and I'm joined today by a host of industry experts and specialists, notably our trade partners FIS, but also people from the contracting sector and also from the supply chain and design sectors as well. I'm going to give you an overview of what's going to go on shortly, but then we'll get around to the introductions and then start with the panel session. So just to briefly discuss what we're going to cover today, we're going to look at a typical interiors project, right through from concept straight through to completion. The panel's going to interrogate the various stages of work, what happens, what are the barriers to collaboration today, and then we're going to start to consider things like what greater collaboration really means and how this can be achieved. We're also going to look at how we can communicate better and how we can use digital solutions to communicate, collaborate, avoid rework, manage risk and design liability, engage with the supply chain, reduce costs, and eliminate waste. This sounds like a heck of a lot, but there are solutions out there, and it's part of the topic that the panel are going to discuss today, and no doubt we're going to bring some light to it. So to sum up, the aim today is to understand how innovation and collaboration can help the fit-out sector. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers and in no preferable order. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So first off, Ian, can you introduce yourself, please?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Ian Mckinley and I'm CEO of the finishing interior sector, which is the trade body that looks after the £10 billion finishing and fit-out sector within construction. I'm also Vice Chairman of the Construction Products Association, having run the British Woodworking Federation for 7 years, and helped establish the fire door inspection scheme, and being a non-exec director of the Confederation of Timber Industries and Fencer along the way. Originally a materials engineer, no idea how I ended up here really. I started life in a scaffolding company.
Excellent, thanks very much, Ian. Richard, could you go next, please?
Morning, everybody. Richard Jones, Managing Director of Paramount Office Interiors Limited. We specialise in interior fit-outs, furniture, refurbishment and construction projects across the UK from our offices in Cardiff and Bristol. And I'm also Vice President of the Finishes and Interior sector.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Richard. Tim, over to you. Could you introduce, please? Tim, I think you're muted, pal.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Take two. Tim Spencer, Rockfon Technical Manager. And Rockfon is part of the Rockwall International Group. We're involved with the manufacture of ceilings and interior finishes that are used in a wide range of applications in both refurbishment, fit-out and new build. And I've been involved in the construction, started in the heavy construction industry many years ago, in fact, more than 30 years ago, and worked through into the interior sector. Great, thanks very much, Tim. James, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure, good morning, everybody. James McQuaid, Company Director at Errigal. If you don't know Errigal, we turn over about 120 million and specialise in dry lining, facades and fit-out. And we operate across 8 different jurisdictions currently.
Excellent. Thanks very much, James. Steve, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hi, everyone. My name is Steve Watson. I'm National Supply Chain Director for Wilmot Dixon Construction. Wilmot Dixon, we have a construction and an interiors business. We currently turn over 1.3 billion. And I'm responsible for creating and implementing the supply chain strategy for our construction business. And I've worked at Wilmot since 2007.
Brilliant, thank you. And last but not least, Mr. Swaddle, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, of course. Paul Swaddle, I'm Head of Technical Solutions at MBS. So I help our customers to implement our products. That could be across BIM processes, often architects, engineers, and across the construction sector. I'm an architect by background, so I come from that design side, and hopefully can respond to some of the questions from that perspective today.
Excellent. Thanks very much. So very clear and experienced lineup there. So hopefully it's going to bring some good discussion. Just a bit of advice to anybody that's listening. All attendees' microphones are muted. If people want to ask questions, you can submit those through the questions and answers box. Obviously, this is a live session, and as always with the typical MBS panel sessions and webinars, we've got a really high number of attendees today. So we will try and answer as many of those as possible at the end of the session. If we don't get round to answering your particular question live, we will almost certainly respond to these by email afterwards. So please don't be upset if we don't actually get round to your question. On the actual timings of today's session, it's going to be approximately 90 minutes. We'll try to keep it just under that, but the session will also be recorded, and we'll make this available on demand at the mbs.com/events. Okay, if anybody's on social media, if they feel free to tweet or whatever you want to do as you go along, if you want to tag MBS and it's at the MBS, by all means, we're happy to people to share these kind of things as we go along. And then just one thing that I'd just like to cover. Obviously, this is a live session and we've got a lot of guests in, and whilst I'm very, very sure that we're going to hear a lot of experienced and very professional responses and discussions, not everybody is from MBS, so all views and things that are discussed are not necessarily those views of MBS. So yeah, on that note, I think it's a good time to actually start the session. So let's go through with some of those questions. I'm going to fire the first one off to Richard, I think, on this one. Richard, if that's okay. Obviously, we've got a lot of people on the call today that are listening that are from various backgrounds. We've got designers, contractors, manufacturers. Some people are new to the industry. Some are obviously quite experienced. But from your point of view, could you talk us through the typical stages of an interiors project, please?
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Lee. Okay. I'm going to base the answer to this on what on a sort of a typical tendered scheme. The first phase really is the initial contact from either the client or a member of their sort of appointed project team to advise that there's a potential scheme on the horizon and to ask if we are interested in looking at the scheme. Once that conversation has happened, it's normal process over the last few years. I've noticed that for us to get a receipt of a PQQ or an expression of interest document that needs to be sort of filled out, completed and returned to ensure that you've got the required skill sets, level of experience, insurances, etc. Once that document's been returned, the tender list is compiled, and as a tendering contractor, you then receive that tender. Mostly this day and age, it's electronic. It's very rare that tender documents are issued through the post. It's sent via Dropbox or WeTransfer or such platforms. Once that then comes in, the commercial team, the design team, etc., they carry out an initial review of those tender documents, arrange a site visit, and commence with compiling a list of TQs, RFIs, etc., that get sent back over to the people that are administering the tender. And something else we've noticed over the last few years as well, that usually the tender documents are issued and there's further information which is usually classed as to follow, such as structural engineering info, MEP specifications, etc. So you actually receive the tender document early, but have to wait for more information to be sent across. Usually then the response is then received for those TQs and RFIs that you've raised, and it's quite often that some of those responses are answered to follow or contract to advise on their assumptions within their tender return, or it's stipulated that those questions that can't be answered are covered via a provisional sum. That becomes a little bit difficult on schemes that are under a JCT, D&B or contractor's design portion, as there's the potential for further issues down the line due to those employers' requirements not being clarified at the outset. But we can pick up on that later. Tenders are then completed, returned for review. It's a post-tender adjudication period, and it's normal practice these days to attend a post-tender interview where you discuss your bids, methodology, etc., answer any further queries. If you're successful, instruction to proceed is usually given via a limited letter of intent, which allows you to commence with validation surveys, asbestos DNR surveys, the detailed design phase. We've noticed again, majority of schemes are only really sort of designed to REBA stage 2 or 3 at tender stage. So there's a considerable amount of work that's then needed to get the project to the required stage where it can commence on site, creates time pressures, etc. Building control notices are issued, F10s issued, construction phase plans populated and issued, and then you finally get the works to commence on site, and goes whatever the construction period is, and then you have regular progress meetings, usually monthly. Certain schemes you'll have those fortnightly, depending on size of project, complexities, etc. And then once the works are completed, you move into the closeout phase, which is the commissioning, witnessing, building control sign off, health and safety file documentation, etc. So that's, without getting into the nitty gritty of the actual sort of project. Yeah, that's pretty much the process, really.
Great. I think just noting sort of one thing that you mentioned in there about the tender stage being at around stage 2 or 3. Obviously moving into stage 4, which is the technical design stage, where the final sort of specification tends to be sort of, outlined and issued. I'm guessing that's something that the contractors having to get quite heavily involved with. Is that where you potentially involve the supply chain with designs of like materials and systems and things?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. It's important there to make sure that you get the buy-in of the supply chain, subcontractors, material suppliers, etc., to ensure that what is specified or suggested is actually buildable and can actually work, and trying to sort of iron out as many of those initial issues as you can up front, so that it prevents issues further down the line whilst you're actually on site, which then has further time, can have time implications, cost implications, etc. So I think it's important to get as much buy-in at that stage as you physically can.
Brilliant. Great. Thanks very much, Richard. That's really sort of cleared up what goes on there. Going to fire the next 2 questions to Steve and James. So I'll maybe pick on Steve first. Obviously, we've just heard from Richard about how the typical project timeline goes. For yourselves, have you noticed any change in how these are sort of delivered and conducted of late, Steve?
Yes. Well, firstly, Wilmot Dixon, we're kind of quite fortunate in the fact that 70% of our work is through frameworks. Yeah. And with the frameworks that we're on, the majority of them want us to be involved at stage 1, which is feasibility. So apart from that, obviously we'd be involved in stage 3 and stage 4, like you've said. The advantage of being there at feasibility is the fact that this is, tying into the subject of collaboration. We actually try and move our supply chain in as early as we possibly can, rather than kind of keeping them at arm's length till stage 4. We actually help. We want that special advice up front. Yeah. Slightly different from interiors business, because they've actually got an in-house architect and design team. So they will just really reach out to the critical trades, such as M&E, for example. So that's kind of how we work on a typical basis. But of late, despite, as I said, that's why I mentioned about the fact that we're on frameworks, because we still, obviously, they're long-term frameworks, and we still are getting the benefit of being involved really, really early. But outside of this, we are starting to see far more competitive tenders come in now, and single-stage tenders, which does change the approach. It does change your approach to collaboration slightly, and it does therefore mean that we're involved later. For example, stage 3 and stage 4, which isn't really the type of work that we like to get involved in. So definitely there has been a shift, with the change of the market and the economic situation, the fact that I think some customers are starting to question the value, or at least understanding the value they get from 2 stages, that we are seeing this move to as I say, more competitive tendering and finding information out later than we normally would, or just being given everything to price. In terms of changes, in addition to that, is really, I suppose, we're just now involving our supply chain and communicating with them as much as we can to make sure that they're informed and they stand a better chance of delivering quality product that's built on time. So definitely say the changes there are we're getting closer because of the market. We need to.
Okay.
I don't know if
yeah, no, that's great. I mean, that obviously we've all experienced some impacts in the past 6 months that nobody could have, I guess, foreseen fully. Is the integration with things like digital technology and stuff moving a lot more in that sense?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, well, yeah, in our business, again, going back to the frameworks, all of them have to be BIM compliant and what have you. We can't get away from that anymore. I mean, it's not something we want to embrace anyway, but we just found the fact that change is starting to happen a bit quicker now. I think before it was, every customer you speak to, they want something slightly different, whereas digital is pretty much at the forefront of everything that we're doing now, and that has been a big change. But that's probably a change we've been seeing over the last 18 months really, rather than the last 6.
Great. And James, how are you finding it yourself? Is there any changes notable from your perspective?
Yeah, I'll have to echo what the two guys have just said, that definitely as a subcontractor, we're engaging a lot more at tender stage. We're being asked to engage earlier, I suppose, which is really beneficial for us as well. And we do give, a lot of value engineering and design input at that point, generally. But in terms of then the delivery of the projects, I suppose, is where there's also a notable shift when it comes to the live construction part. I definitely see with a lot of the clients we work with a shift towards more collaborative planning on site, things like glass planner or pull planning, and it's been really encouraging. I suppose we'd invested heavily in that approach about 2-3 years ago now. We have like a data team, we have a really strong planning team and a whole digital production team. So we see it heading that direction even further, and it feels like it's just a starting point really now. And for collaborative planning to properly take effect, I suppose, it's like there was a famous American engineer, I think it was William Denning or something like that. His quote was, "In God we trust, all others must bring data." So I think that's very appropriate on a construction project. That people word of mouth. You can't just take someone's word for it. They need to be able to prove it through data. And I suppose that's sort of where we're headed. And we've definitely seen that as clients love the approach we take now on that. And I think it's just a taste really of what's to come from us, but also I think that's just, we're seeing it from competitors and other people in different specialisms taking the same approach. And it's really encouraging, and I think that's needs to go.
Great stuff. Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of sort of famous quotes that go around. I think one that springs to mind with me is data is the new oil. I think in an industry where we're trying to push everything towards low emissions and carbon neutral, I think there's definitely a lot of scope in that. One of the things, obviously, that the data brings, and having that clarity with it, is it's obviously identifying risks or any issues a lot more clearly than things have been before.
Yeah, one thing I'll add to that, I suppose, I didn't mention, was all the digital is great, but sometimes people forget to do the training on how to actually plan. So I think that's one gap that I see as well. So people tend to leap over that part and go straight into the digital, but the upfront planning has to be done. The training has to be done to enable people to understand what to do. So the digital is just the last piece of the puzzle, really.
Mm-hmm. It needs a clear process and steps, and then the digital stitches it together in effect. Yeah, that's great. I mean, obviously I mentioned just about the risks being sort of more identifiable through having access to that data. Just going to point a question to Ian. Ian, are you noticing any sort of changes, or are you observing anybody conducting good risk management? And do you think people are understanding the risks and what the sort of industry status is at the moment? Is that becoming more identifiable?
I think the short answer is yes, but I'm going to be slightly more negative than other people we've heard so far, because I think, as Steve alluded to, there's different parts of the construction industry that operate in different ways. So I do think the culture is changing. I do think there's examples of good practice, but I still think for large swathes of the market, there's a need to differentiate between risk management and risk mitigation. And by that, I mean the difference between actually solving the problem or covering your bum so it's not your fault. I think the building safety bill, and I know we'll come on to that later, leans towards this and helps. I mean, I think there's many examples. I often think of Oxscan's tools where you see a badly communicated design introducing a defect down the line, effectively a slightly increased size of cavity. And at the end of it, whose fault was it that wall fell over? Well, it was the designer for not communicating, it was the contractor for not doing the detail work, and it was the person laying the bricks because they didn't report back that the ties weren't reaching. It's not an isolated instance. We do see it time and time again, and we've talked about some of the contracts going out with words like contractor's choice on it, and it's ending up as contractor's choice with early engagement, where there is positive engagement, the contractor is being consulted. At times the risk is just being dumped on them, and on site we're seeing the problem. And the question we get would be, can I really fit all those service penetrations through that gap? Well, the answer is no. At some point in design, somebody should have thought of that, but now we're on site with the weight of liquidated damages distorting the decisions that are being made. So I think, yes, there's some really good stuff, but also I think there's swathes of the industry that need to wake up and understand that risk better, and accept that you can't just drop a risk into a contract. You've got to manage it through the process with collaboration in the way that my colleagues have talked about here. I mean, it's actually I'll just quickly touch on a good example of that, because someone FIS has done recently. Is there examples of better collaboration? Well, yes. I mean, we've just worked with a number of trade bodies from across the sector, the Building Engineering Services Association, Association of Specialist Fire Protection, to look. I touched upon the issue of fire stopping and service penetrations, and we've just produced a detailed guide, and it's there to sort of help everybody through the supply chain make the right decisions. But there's 9 golden rules in it, and golden rule number 1 is early engagement. Early engagement.
Great. And do you think that sort of is carried on through when it gets to sort of stage 4, 5, when things are actually being tendered and procured? Is that early engagement helping the decisions to be made more responsibly at that point?
It would always help, but again, just practically, I was talking to a dry lining contractor yesterday who was given 3 weeks notice on a lump sum job, and I fear that when that happens, what happens if there is a detailing issue? So what happens on the site? What happens in the real world is we get to the problem. A good contractor may walk away from the job, right? A good contractor may actually just walk away from that. So the risk, it can't be done. The risk is too much. And a good professional contractor may just walk away. Does that mean the job doesn't get done? Not always. It means the next contractor who's hungrier, who's not read the contract, is less cognizant of the risk, takes it on. And that still happens in construction. That's still a concern to me.
Great. So there's obviously a clear sort of need there for that sort of competency sort of monitoring, I think. And that brings us quite well into the next question that I'd sort of got lined up. So I'm going to fire this to Paul at first as an architect and a designer. But with regards to competency, that's one of the things that's obviously clearly mentioned, Paul, in the draft safety bill. Do you foresee any changes following the publication of that in this sector at all?
Yeah, I hope so. I think this is probably less about the mutual collaboration that we're talking about most of today, and more about an enforcement of a framework and a mechanism to eliminate some of those issues and some of those risks. And as Dame Hackett says, with teeth. So having sanctions and fines that are going to be deterrents, to people gaming the system at various stages. But I think whatever the process becomes, regulatory or otherwise, it has to just be more transparent. We have to be aware of exactly what's happening at every stage of the project and who's involved with what decision. The competency thing is really interesting from my perspective. Obviously, architects are mentioned specifically in the bill because of the Architects Act. But I welcome it. I think I'm not sure if I'm in the minority or the majority to welcome it, but I think I really welcome both the ARB and the RIBA's desire to improve competency across the industry. And I think we have to look at a very changing way that architects operate, a very changing way that our skills are required on projects, and to understand that for a modern construction industry, we need a modern role. And so to ensure that if I wasn't competent on a project, I'd want to know, I'd want to be able to know that my technical skills required some uplift and to know where those gaps were, just in the same way as competency across a huge amount of sectors and industries, medicine being a great example, where you would expect people to achieve a level of competency and maintain it. We already have to submit a certain amount of CPD, continuing that kind of professional qualification development across your career. But this is just a next level to really understand the role that we have on projects, I think.
Sure, yeah. Obviously, it very clearly sort of outlines the architect's scope in there, but I think that there's obviously a lot of room for other trades and skills within the industry to have that sort of competency and continual professional development learning as well. So whether we'll see CPD being pushed out to different sort of skill sets within the industry, who knows? But yeah, I think it's definitely the right move. As you say, whether it's welcomed by everybody or not is probably sort of that Marmite situation where some people are going to love it and some people aren't. But yeah.
And I think that when it comes to fear around competency, it often comes down to what's the cost of it? What's the cost of the exams and the employer's going to have to pay for it? Yeah. What's the time it's going to take to do it? And our employer's going to be open to the time to revise and do exams and things. But also just fear of failure and the idea that you are going to be found out and found that, to be wanting in some area of the knowledge that you have. But that's a good thing in terms of us improving the industry wider.
Great. Thanks very much, Paul. And Ian, obviously you raised this briefly just in the last sort of response. Can you foresee any sort of significant changes happening?
I think potentially it's going to have a profound effect on the procurement and construction process. It certainly calls into question the sort of design and build has a huge place in the marketplace, but what often happens is design a bit, build a bit, redesign and build a bit more. And that's what it's going to call into question. Because if we look at the elements of the build, first of all, you've got the three sort of gateway points that put a very clear requirement on what information needs to pass at what stage of a project. And there's you can't just sort of carry on. You've got to stop. There's a stop point, stop, check, carry on, which is going to be positive. I think the joint regulator makes a lot of sense, because a bit like construction, the problem seldom the product, it's often the interface, and the same often with bad regulators is worse than bad regulation, because actually you distort the plan code. So I think that's positive. And I think one of the things just to quickly flag is there is a bit of a misconception. This applies only to buildings of high risk, high rise residential building. It actually applies to all. It's just slightly more stringent, and there's more prescriptive requirement when you get into that environment. I like the concept of clear duty holders, because accountability is very important. So you've got significantly the principal contractor, principal designer have to sign a declaration that the building will comply. An individual has to put their name on a piece of paper that says I'm accountable for that. And I think that's a big step. And as soon as you start to have individual responsibility, you start to look at the potential sanctions that can be made and criminal liabilities there, and that makes people stop and think. So again, I think where you're under a bit of cost pressure to save a bit of money, you could go to prison for the decision that you make, and I think that is going to be quite significant. Also, it changes things like the how quickly through sort of Section 38 rectification works will have to be done and sanctions can be made. So you're moving from 2 to 10 years. So again, there's that little bit more about not just what you do, but how it continues to perform through operation. I think transparency through BIM and the digital, which Paul mentioned, is only going to be a good thing. And I think that the forcing people to think about competence and what competence actually means and how we demonstrate that starts to push us away. And my hope is that in that, if you're saying that your supply chain have to be competent and you have to do something to ensure they're competent, they're giving them very little notice to do the workforce planning that's required around that is going to become very, very difficult. And again, it's going to push people towards the fact we actually need to line things up. And for contractors, if you've got 2 weeks notice to mobilize 50, 100 people, however many it is on site, that's not great. That's not great if you wanted to make sure that all of those are competent whilst you're still redesigning the project on the fly. These things got to change. So I think in the long run, it will be a good thing. I think legislation helps to inform culture, but culture has to change around it as well. So I think it's a positive step in the right direction.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, it's that cultural thing, which it's a human problem, isn't it? It's not something that technology or legislation sort of controls, but they can influence it and help it in that situation. I think it's quite interesting that you mentioned about people looking to save money and maybe sort of mistakes being made there. Now, back in February, MBS held the CPLS, the Construction Product Leaders Summit, where we heard from Dame Judith Hackett, and she very clearly mentioned there that we need to turn this value engineering process on its head from being about bottom line to quality. And I think quite rightly, like you say, as people are going to have a lot more potential for reprimand if things aren't conducted as accurately as they should be. That could possibly, I suppose, drive up costs, but then is the cheaper option necessarily the cheapest option, if that makes sense?
Value engineering is fine. It's cost engineering is the problem.
Yeah.
I think one of the most scary figures that I ever saw was published by Zero Carbon Hub, and it wasn't actually directly related to fibre. It was a report that they commissioned to look at energy efficiency within house building, and they found out on 100% of sites there was product substitution that hadn't been recorded. And wow. Every single site, which would potentially have an impact on the performance of the building, but nobody would ever know because it wasn't recorded.
I think that's one of the difficulties as well, particularly with things like energy efficiency. Most of the products tend to be hidden in between the bricks and the walls and cupboards and things. So yeah, that's there. You touched on the stage gates as well, and obviously those align against the RIBA plan of work. For yourself, James, I think I'd maybe like to sort of target this one. With respect to quality, how do you see this validated through each of those stages of work currently? And obviously you expecting any changes now following this announcement earlier this year?
Yeah, well, I suppose from ourselves, we work a lot with manufacturers. So, if it's at the tender stage, we put a lot of work in with designing the build alongside our manufacturers, and thankfully, British Gypsum and the like they have their sort of published standards, which are pretty easy to follow. So, it's not so hard, I think, from a design perspective to design it right for our specialisms. It's more about the build itself, the quality of the actual build. And thankfully we have, I know I can't speak for other companies in our industry, but I know that we have a lot of controls in place at a pre-construction stage that we say, for instance, to make sure that we have the right products. As Ian just mentioned, we build up the exact products in our pre-construction system, for example, and we physically can't, our site teams can't buy the wrong product essentially for what they're building. So it's more then about the labor. Are they installing it correctly? And that's where, you mentioned the human problem. We put a lot of emphasis on training in our company. And if we identify guys that need further training, we take them back to our training centers and train them properly. But, that's if they're new into our site. But generally, we know, we do understand. We have, reviews of the quality of each person. So kind of putting that level of effort into understanding your workforce, understanding how any skills gaps, and having the right even technology to help with quick upskilling, because a lot of the stuff that isn't very hard to learn. So if you use like on-demand micro-learning and platforms like that, you can very quickly get results and improve the quality of the labor aspect. Then when it comes to actually documenting that and presenting that to the main contractors we work with, I do see problems in terms of systematically that some main contractors might insist that we, for example, use their system. It could be as simple as this. We have to use their platform for our quality, which is, it just presents extra challenges to site teams that they have to even learn a new system to even document it properly and all these things. So I think that's the current situation. I see in future probably data sharing platforms, along with probably in-house data capabilities and sort of use of AI, as we're even sort of experimenting on all those things. I see that as probably it's probably 5 to 10 years away before you'll see a noticeable change on that. But
yeah.
It's a complicated one, but I think thankfully it's definitely getting a lot better than it was. It's definitely moving in the right direction. There's still challenges, but yeah, it's definitely headed there.
Good stuff. Yeah, I think that 5 to 10 year sort of time scale with things like AI and that is obviously a clear one. We had it with the BIM thing when that was announced by Francis Mordred about 2011, was it, that it was going to be mandatory on public projects, and it's now only sort of just become the norm. I think the latest national BIM report placed it at just over 70% of the industry have now adopted BIM. So yeah, the technology is there. Usually it's getting that collaboration and people taking it on. I think it was quite interesting that you just mentioned about the training internally and making sure that people do that. I think that's one sort of area of collaboration that people might dismiss. You think the word collaboration and you instantly go to things like Teams and Zoom and people collaborating and sending documents around on there, but it's that internal collaboration, I suppose, within organizations themselves, where if you can acknowledge and sort of recognize that you might have some staff that are more skilled than others and getting the others trained up instead of maybe punishing people or dismissing certain skill sets, identifying that is great, and it's really fantastic to hear that you're doing that, James. That's brilliant. Paul, just quickly fire that back to yourself. From a design point of view, the validation stages, how do you foresee these impacting and changing?
Yeah, we at MBS did a series on the plan of work, a series of webinars, and one of the things that comes up quite clear is the need now for non-graphical information to be as critical as the graphical information. Mm-hmm. And in particular around specification of quality. The RIBA, CIOB and RICS did a thing called Building in Quality and the Quality Tracker a couple of years ago, which was a great project looking at how do you actually get a definition of quality on a project that everybody agrees with and that you can kind of work to and track across the project. It was a kind of limited project that the two main blockers really were implementing it and integrating it with kind of current processes. But one of the best outcomes really was the actual collaboration between the professional bodies that actually, there's these institutions and professional bodies that we have and how these sectors, how these disciplines work together in terms of defining what quality is. I think the old excuse is that every building is a prototype. And I think that that's just no longer the case. I think we can say whether it's about testing a prefabricated panel or a portfolio of buildings that are very similar, that we actually learn a huge amount of lessons about how to ensure that every building is learning from the previous past projects. And so I think quality has to improve. We've seen that across a huge number of buildings. And that'll only come through some of the changes that we're seeing around the non-graphical information, that data and information.
Sure, it's interesting there that you just mentioned about every building being a prototype and that not necessarily being the case. Obviously, off-site manufacturers forming a lot of the sort of discussions around this. So let's keep an eye on that, I suppose, and see what happens. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of changes happening, and you raised some really good points there. Without letting Tim sort of feel like he's being left out, we've not actually got round to yourself. Tim, you're obviously the supplier on the panel session. For yourself, how involved are you through those sort of design and tender stages? And if there is anything that's come out of these recent publications or something that's not, what would be the most fundamental thing that you'd like to see change? If you could have your sort of number one wish list.
Okay, in terms of changing things, well, there's an ongoing need to be creative, and in terms of actually communicating with designers at the early stages of projects, we've had to change, as I'm sure everybody has, to accommodate the needs of the pandemic. So there's been lots of digital communications going on, many more than ever before. So that's been useful. The digital information that we have via the likes of MBS has come to the fore as well.
Excellent.
In terms of advising, we're very much involved, or previously involved, in a field capacity. Now we've had to go via the digital route to do that, but it's proved to be very successful. We've had many meetings, Skype, Teams and Zoom, and it's been different, but we're well into it now. And the success, obviously, we will see, but there have been a number of projects that we've turned around, even in this relatively short 6-month period where we've had the initial meetings digitally, and they've actually maybe not fully come to the fore, but certainly there have been a number of mock-ups done, allowing further decisions to be made to proceed then to finished designs. In terms of changing anything for the future, we've heard it mentioned already today, and that is earlier and earliest possible engagement.
Yeah.
That allows us to give and demonstrate the best value, whether it would be by simply advising on the use or the best use of standard materials, or if we see on projects there's a need for specials, because then it's ultimately going to save wastage. That's very good, but we can only do that when we're involved at the earliest possible opportunity and then have time to manufacture this said product.
Great.
Yeah, and there's a similar one, I'd say, on recycling, for example. We hear there are many good examples of recycling, and our experience shows that where a client and a main contractor wants recycling to happen, it happens. Conversely, there are some projects where there's lots of talk and ultimately very little happens. So there's a great opportunity there to improve the delivery of those projects by better planning, better scheduling, and better coordination between all of the relevant parties in the future.
Good stuff. So yeah, I mean, that's a great sort of point that you raised there about the recycling. So sustainability is obviously high on most design's agenda now, and I'm pretty certain Paul would probably back me up there. We've done quite a lot of research on this at MBS, and it's something that I think the pair of us sort of take a personal interest in as well. But obviously that earlier collaboration that you mentioned is only going to help to plan for things like that as well. With regards to the digital aspect, did you find yourselves as a manufacturing supplier being able to sort of pick up with the digital technology and carry on moving quickly through the changes that we've had in the past 6 months?
I'm going to say yes, in short to that, because the advent of MBS Chorus I see as being a great opportunity for the industry as a whole, and the linkage that it creates between all of the different platforms. But I think, well, certainly for us anyway, it's a little bit too early to be able to conclude. But I would say, in short, it can only be a good thing, and will continue to grow and benefit from in the coming years.
Good stuff. It's interesting that you just mentioned MBS Chorus on there. Actually, we were briefly chatting about that earlier on, and I think because that's an online cloud-based tool, which is nothing like that we've had before or the industry's had before, particularly through the pandemic, the shift of people being able to work remotely from home, whether they're on a company device or whether they're on their own tablet or something, that the technology and having that digital and on an internet-based sort of software and nothing to download is really sort of helping that. And it's great to see that that's filtered down to the supply chain. I think for myself, my background is in the manufacturing sector. I've had just over 2 decades in the manufacturing sector before I worked for MBS. I think the BIM transition for me was a big thing, and I suppose where collaboration came in. What I saw there when we were managing this through was we were starting to get engagement at around stage 2 at sometimes, so the concept design stage, when the specifiers and designers were actually starting to drop BIM content into these Revit and ArchiCAD models and so forth. We were getting this sort of notification engagement much earlier. So yeah, everything seems to be coming back on this collaboration piece about early, and obviously it's not just the sort of the safety and the risk, it's things like sustainability and stuff that are clearly being helped by that as well.
Hey, Lee, can I just come in there just very quickly?
Yeah, sure, Ian, of course.
It's a very simple point, but language is everything. And when we see specifications, the door to value engineering is opened by the phrasing on the specification. So equal and approved is the only way we ever want to see a description put in that allows change from the original specification. Equal and, we see equal or approved or equivalent, other random terms, but equal and approved is essential.
Sure, and I think that comes down to that where you mentioned about the principal contract and principal design, and I think the accountability there is likely going to see more of a shift towards that, or hopefully it will. So yeah, thanks very much for that, Ian. Steve, I'm going to divert back to yourself now for a little minute. We've just obviously heard from Tim, and he's been telling us a little bit about how the supply chain sort of engaged from the supplier's point of view. But from yourself, obviously, as the contractor and obviously heading up the supply chain side of things there for Wilmot Dixon, how do you think that the suppliers could be engaged better, or is there any way that you could think of that this could be improved on?
Okay, I would try to make sure that this doesn't turn into a rant and make it more productive. I've got a lot of strong views about this, to be honest with you. So I'll try and make sure it's as positive as it can be. But basically, I think our industry, where we are at the moment, is starting to turn into a lot of positive things. But I would say that we're still an industry where we cooperate rather than collaborate. Mm-hmm. And there's a big difference between the two. You know, we are an industry where we give people a list of things to do, and as long as they do it, we're happy. Whereas, do we actually align our businesses properly? And I think that's probably where the main problem is. So I think it's a complete mixed bag. It's good and bad. I would say if there's anyone on this, anyone here that's a subcontractor will probably feel that they get a completely mixed experience, even with the same main contractors and companies. They probably find that every time, depending on who they speak to, it feels like a different way of working. I think, if I'm being completely honest, I think they're probably still treated quite poorly, to be honest with you. I still think they are kept at arm's length. I still feel there's a lot of people in our industry that feel keeping them at arm's length is how they actually get value, rather than actually bringing people in and making them part of your business. And extension to your business is actually how you really get gains from collaborating. So I think we're really inconsistent, and I suppose there's lots of things about how we can improve that. I think the main problem is our industry doesn't always allow us to commit. We as a company want to commit to our supply chain partners from day one and say, we've already decided who are the right partners for our business. And we want to be able to tell someone straight away that that's going to be their job. Problem is we've created this environment where they feel that value is by getting 5 prices or 3 prices in. We want to be able to commit to people early and say, look, give us your all. Let's come in and sort these, come out with the right solution for, for our customer user. And that culture of being able to commit early, it always takes that away. So a lot of it is about behaviours and trust with that. Are there people in our industry that actually trust people? I think as well, our industry sets up and creates barriers, even in our own businesses. How pre-con and site teams work. One way we've tried to fix that is the site team that deliver the project actually are at pre-construction now. So what happens at a lot of companies is once you've finished pre-con, goes over to a different team, they rip it up and start again, go out to a load of other companies that haven't even engaged at pre-con. We have the same team that follow it through all the way. So there's consistency and continuity. So I think that helps if we remove the barriers that cause, these fractures and these, I suppose, these barriers and lack of trust. We also like to call it engineered value rather than value engineering, because I just think that changes people's way of viewing things. Is, you come up with the right solution to get the value, not try and find the solution because you've ring-fenced how much money you want to spend on it. But a lot of it's got to come from the customers and the people that are actually giving out the work. They've got to create this environment for us where what they want is they want better outcomes. Well, how you do that is by trusting us to if we put forward a price and it's got one partner in it, that should be okay as long as we can justify the cost. So it's better comms. We've got to measure what we do. We need to make our boards as well more accountable. They're the ones that can make this happen. The senior leaders of our business need to encourage this. And just one example, and then I'll shut up, is someone showed me something the other day which I thought was quite interesting. He showed me a picture of a horse and cart with a sat-nav on it. And what he was basically saying is the fact that our industry is horse and cart, and what we do is we bolt bits of technology onto it to make it better. Whereas what the actual problem is, the root of the problem is the behaviours we have and actually the way we work. And we will only change it if we completely reinvent what we do, rather than just thinking various systems and processes are going to make it better. We actually need to get to the crux of the problem, which is about trust, how we procure, how our customers set it up, how we set our businesses up. And I think there's loads of improvements we can make, but if we want to make real change, the industry needs to change with it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've seen some great statistics on things like that. I think we had it was a statistic from Mckinley that was showing that the construction industry is the third slowest industry to adopt change, and it was only third behind agriculture and fishing, which, yeah, obviously agriculture can be really sort of technologically advanced. If you think you get some sort of meat produce from the supermarket, you could probably trace that back to the animal, the farm, etc., through the technology, but ultimately the systems remain the same as it was. Yeah, that horse and cart scenario with the sat nav on, I'm going to have a look for that after this session, because that's really sort of struck a good chord. Yeah, we need to make a change, and like you say, that cultural problem, again, it needs to sort of come from the top down and get those leaders, industry leaders, and business leaders to make that change happen. Paul, obviously we've just heard from Steve, and he's raised some really sort of valid points there. From the design side of things, are you sort of getting the same kind of feeling with that as well?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things both Tim and Steve have said that I agree with, and I think the first is around procuring for value and what that really means. It's not procuring, doing that cost engineering exercise. It's not about finding the procurement routes that are least about litigation and liabilities, but actually the value of the project that you're trying to do in the first place. You've got a set of client requirements, and you're trying to meet that, whether that's with the entire facility or an individual component or product within that building. And I think that the other thing that I agree with is when we think about substitution and the fact that seems to take place on a huge amount of projects. As Ian, I think, said, 100% of the projects that were done in that survey had some form of substitution. And for us at MBS, it's about demonstrating that the performance requirements from the client or from the original specification are met by any of the other options or opportunities to change that product. That's something that MBS Source is trying to do in terms of comparing properties across different products. But I think wider, it's about just having more enhanced data in the industry, whether that's around cost, whether that's around sustainability credentials, or the performance of those particular components and products.
So clarity, I think, is there's the key thing there, isn't it? And gate listing, obviously, that's something that we've really been pushing to try and address at MBS. So, yeah, no, it's great to see that the contractor and designer sort of outlooks as pretty much aligned, really, in that sense. Obviously, you're looking at it from different angles, but the same sort of clarity, collaboration, and top-down approach is what's going there.
Hey, Lee, can I hop in again? Sorry to be...
Yeah, of course, Ian. Yeah, please.
It's just one thing I have a slight issue with is industries don't change, people do.
Yeah.
So we can't... No change happens unless we all change. And it's very easy. I think in construction, we often play a blame game where it's the major contractor's fault, it's the specifier's fault, it's all the client's fault, and it's all of our fault. And I know from some of the work we're doing with product manufacturers, we as an industry, when we're supplying product, have to be responsible in the way that we're doing it. The Construction Products Association now has the Marketing Integrity Group, because it's really important that you make clear what your product does and what the limitations are. We see magic products sold all the time, fireproof foam that people can fill every hole with. If you actually look at the test evidence, it's buried away in there, but you've got a tiny little hole that can be filled effectively with that material. It's not all things for men. So I think it's really important to look at how we present information and more consistently to the specifiers. And we don't throw 150-page test reports at people and call them an idiot because they don't understand them. We draw out the key and salient points. And I know we did some work on acoustic verification, if I run an acoustic verification scheme. And one of the reasons we did that was we were a bit concerned about the way data was being presented within our own marketplace. If you're selling an operable wall, then the very least you should expect from the test evidence presented is that what you tested was an operating wall, not a wall that could be operated if you pulled all the cork out of the joints. Mm-hmm. If you're testing a partition, it looks like what a partition would look like in real life. It's not a tiny little window. It's about, you could get away with things in the testing environment. And I think we have to be better and clearer, and using tools like MBS to present that information more consistently, so the specifiers can easily interpret it. And equally, the specifiers have huge influence on the client. So Steve talked about what a responsible contractor does there. James talked about what a responsible specialist contractor does. That should be rewarded through the supply chain, but it isn't in this sort of cost-based value engineering process that we currently adopt. It's lowest price wins, worst contractor wins.
To support that, Ian, I think that comes out strongly in the Hackett review as well, in terms of the building as a set of systems, that have to coordinate together, that have to be working as one operating mechanism.
I think it's quite interesting that we're mentioning that about product testing and then systems. I mean, if you look at certain other industries, and I know you've just mentioned that it's the people that change in that industry, but I suppose people are the industry. Automotive, great example of that. You buy a vehicle which has X amount of miles per gallon sort of economy listed. It's always done under test conditions. It will never ever perform that way in the real world. But construction products, fire testing, for example, it's done on sort of sheet material, single substrates that could be mounted in a little L shape or wherever, but it's not actually that full system. And as Paul's just mentioned, with things like what MBS are looking at and things that have come up in the Hackett report, I think Uniclass, from a classification point of view, obviously everybody's familiar with MBS building or the common arrangement to work sections, but Uniclass has been obviously identified by the UK BIM framework as being a better classification system, and being able to break down what is actually a system or a product and identifying that through those test conditions. I think that's something that we could certainly look at, but again, boils down to collaboration.
I'm just going to interject again, because the correlation to automotive is one that I think is fair but frustrates me as well. Construction is too big to fail. We can't put a prototype on a track and get the stick to chuck it around the corner. It is different, and we have to accept that we're different, and we have to operate differently. And in many ways that makes the collaboration even more important, because you can't get the stick to break a couple before we get it right. Now, if you look at the relative size of a construction project to anybody's investment, it's enormous almost every time. And I think that's something we have to recognise.
Do you think that the modern methods of construction might change that, Ian, slightly? Just very quickly.
I think it can. I think the term models and methods of construction gets distorted. There's modern methods of construction within traditional construction. It's not all about a steel frame building. It's about systems within buildings. I think maybe that term has become somewhat distorted. There's all sorts of modern methods of construction. A door set is a modern method of construction. It's a single entity. If I look at the way that windows have been manufactured, you used to buy timber frames, glaze them on site, paint them on site. Now you buy systems. Modern methods of construction have crept in and are being used throughout traditional builds. So it's not a one thing or another. It's a collaborative approach. And I think sometimes some of these terms feel like they're going to disrupt the market and they scare people away from them. And actually, the things we should be embracing and can support the work that all of us do.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a fair point. The terminology, I think, can sometimes be a bit of a barrier in our industry, and from a collaboration point of view, I think maybe if we reined in a little bit on throwing acronyms and terms and stuff around so much, it might help people to understand across the board that little bit more. That's some really great points there. I'm going to sort of throw an open topic out, but it might be great to get somebody's opinion first off that we've not heard from for a while. So Richard, maybe I could ask you to answer this one first. We've heard a lot of what people are seeing and experiencing now with regards to the need for collaboration. But as an industry and as an individual, are you seeing any benefits of collaboration that's been happening now? I
think the aspiration is there for greater collaboration, but I think a lot of it comes back to there's usually so many time pressures on projects that it just falls apart. Really, everybody sets out with the best intentions of that collaboration, but things just seem to slip for whatever reason that is, and everybody. And again, it's only my personal opinion, but it feels as though you're always trying to play catch up. I don't know what everybody else's thoughts on that are, and as I say, that's only my opinion. Everybody tries, but there's just so many different schemes that we work on where there's so much information missing that you almost feel as though you take a step forward, but then you have to completely unpick it and take 2 steps back to then try and move another step forward, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And as I say, my response to that is based on projects that we're actually working on at the moment, on site and also in the early stages as well.
Okay. Anybody else that's on the panel? Obviously, if you've got any sort of opinions on that, if you want to sort of go, James.
Yeah, so a few things mentioned there. I think, on Richard's point there, I think collaboration is difficult. I think, that's probably the central point to it. It's not just a matter of choice. Sometimes people want to collaborate as well, but there are skills involved, and clear communication and planning ability is probably 2 things that are very central to it. And I think that has to be acknowledged, and until you acknowledge that and invest in it, then you're never really going to get there either. I think that's sort of the point on collaboration. But a few comments there on, and Steve brought it up, and I agree with him that on some projects with some partners, you might get treated differently in terms of respect. Respect is also central to it. But I do have to say that we should probably, we work across 8 different jurisdictions. I have to say the UK is probably at the top of that in terms of respect for each other. I know it's still there's still room for improvement, but I think from a context of other countries, we're actually doing quite well there. And then the other thing we haven't really mentioned today is the pressures of productivity, I suppose. That's probably, from a global context, I think that's where, either global population growth, there will be so much pressure on productivity and being able to build many more units for many more. I think we have to acknowledge that the net result of that might mean that competitors will come from different places with globalization, and unless we sort of realize that, first of all, and it won't really kick people into action to buy into it from the top in organizations. It needs to be bought into from the top in organizations, and until they realize that, right, we need to actually change here, or else we might be replaced within the next 10, 20 years, who knows, then that's where it needs to start. And it can't come from employees in the organization, it needs to come from the top. None of these things will be bought into unless the leaders of each organization drive it,
Sure. Steve, can I sort of fire that one to yourself? Obviously, from Wilmot Dixon, you've already mentioned that you have that continuity through obviously having your own in-house sort of designers and things as well. You're obviously collaborating there a lot, but in comparison to James, how are you seeing current collaboration processes now?
Just within our business, or in
within
general?
your business, and how you sort of collaborate with people externally from that point forward as well?
Yeah, I mean, the main thing for us, I suppose, is we try to build kind of long-term relationships with our suppliers first and foremost. So, and not large organizations as well. Our strategy is to work with SMEs because we want to know, everyone within the company and, the owners and what have you, and almost be quite important and relevant to their business. So we kind of deliberately choose companies that are of a smaller size, and we make up more of their turnover so we can become more important to them, and then we get that engagement. So that's kind of a deliberate approach of how we kind of form relationships. And then in terms of collaboration, it's just constant communication with them, really. We have many mechanisms to ensure that they're aware of what's going on in our business. For example, we tell them on a weekly basis every single project that's in pre-construction, every single job that's on live sites. They have access to all of our people. Every one of our supply chain partners given all of the contact details for all of our people that work within the business. Everyone should have an open door approach to them. Keep on sharing information with them, and make sure, I suppose, they understand what the year looks like for them. If they need £3 million worth of turnover from us in a year, to sustain their business and grow and be healthy, then we've got a duty to almost outline what that looks like for them. And obviously we've got to be careful because of obviously competition law and making sure that we're competitive and what have you. But we almost treat them, and as I say, we are far from perfect, by the way. We are far from perfect and we are inconsistent. But what we try to do is treat them like they're actually Wilmot Dixon people and they're extensions of our business, And with that, you've got that trust and belief straight away. The issues we have in our business is not everyone believes in it and believes in that approach, or they've got, as it's been mentioned, they've got their own pressures. You know, finances do get in the way. That's probably the biggest thing though in the industry. The money side actually gets in the way sometimes of what we're trying to achieve. In terms of the industry, I think there's loads of good stuff out there now. You've got like the sustainability school that's all about, you know, getting closer, helping partners out. And there's things like this. So there's clearly a shift and an emphasis because everyone talks about collaboration now and people are starting to move that way and they want the industry to go in that direction. All I would say from interacting with the main contractors is I still think we talk about it rather than actually putting those things into practice. We like the idea of it, but when it actually comes to doing it, we're a little bit scared and we're not brave enough to take the plunge. Right. But that's, for me, to summarize, because I'm talking a lot, it's good communication and it's making sure your supply chain feel part of your business and values. And then also you've got to listen to them as well. We ask for feedback from our supply chain, you know, once a year, tell us where we're going wrong, because if we don't listen to them, they basically, our supply chain shape our strategy rather than we decide what it is and you follow. It's a case of help us improve. So I think that's a large part of it as well. Actually listen to how they feel about how they're being treated.
Brilliant.
There's another point there, Lee.
Really great. Yeah.
Another point there around, I mean, James mentioned productivity, and fundamentally we have a problem, and COVID has made that worse, and that has made it more. I mean, the survey we did in June, only 12% of our members can make money on all sites they're currently working on. And it has severely dented productivity. And that's in an environment where the average profitability of the top 100 contractors in the UK is knocking around at less than 1.8%, less than 2%, at 1.8%. So we have to address that, and we're going to address that through looking at productivity in a more structured way. And again, just some of the numbers. UK procurement takes 50% longer than the equivalent process in Germany. 50% longer. I mean, they knock out 3.6 homes per 1,000 people to our 2.25. Yeah, they're more effective in getting things, the shovels in the ground. You know, we spend double the norm on legal fees in this industry. So bear in mind the 1.6% profitability, 1.6% of turnover is spent on legal fees because we create this adversarial contract environment. So if COVID is a great realization, one of the things that is coming out of this, and we are having more structured conversations with tier one contractors about their concerns about the resilience of the supply chain in this sort of changing and rapidly changing environment. So we do really have to look at productivity through the supply chain as a priority. And for me, that starts with contracts as well. You know, we're not called contractors by accident. What drives our business is contracts. And we set up in 19, whenever it was, we set up a system of contracts, JCTs, and we've got the NECs and other standard contracts now. Yet we never use them. We agreed there was a fair sharing of risk, and we stopped using them years ago. I mean, my record recently, and it was through a group we're working in Scotland, we saw a 69-page amendment to a standard JCT issued by a local authority. And how can you make that many changes to a standard contract? It's not a standard contract anymore. It's a risk mitigation tool that's pushed things out to the supply chain. And I think we do need to start there. I think we need to go back to some of the first principles and say, what contracts are we working to? And so we start to say we engage early, we engage fairly, and we engage responsibly. And that's what, you know, that's, to be fair to Steve and what he's saying, Steve is living and breathing some of these principles. I mean, we were involved with, or I was involved previously with my life at FIS in some of the Better Doors workshops that kicked off some of the work that they're doing. And I have to say they were some of the most productive sessions that I've ever been involved in, because I think it was the first time in my professional career in construction there were designers, surveyors, manufacturers and installers all in the same room looking at a common set of problems. You know, it was exceptionally well run by Steve's colleague Kevin. And you know, everyone left. I think everyone walked in. When I was walking into them, everyone was sort of nudging me, saying, "What's this about? How are they going to how are they using this to beat us up again? What's their agenda?" And everyone walked out and sort of congregated in the pub afterwards, and that was pretty good. I enjoyed that. And actually, what we found was that the common problems were common problems, and there was some relatively simple solutions to them. And it just, you know, Wilmot Dixon took the lead, knocked heads, and and I hope for them that's worked within their business. But I know, you know, we need to see the good contractors win and the bad ones disappear, frankly.
Great stuff.
Just to sorry to jump in, just
okay.
to add something to what Ian said, because I think it's really important, is a bit of, in terms of listening to your supply chain, I've got some good feedback that ties into what Ian just said 2 weeks ago. The fact that a company came to us and basically said, you are not easy enough to do business with, and you can either kind of ignore it and say, what do they know, you know, or you can actually listen to what, you know, listen to it and actually try and do something about it. And what they're basically saying is, you know, when we appoint them and put them in contract, every time is painful, and we just don't make it an easy experience for them to get into contract. So we can either ignore it or do something about it. And we've always had, again, a bit of a dream for a while that we want all of our supply chain in standard annual contracts, and we just have a small you know, some small details that change per contract, because obviously every job is slightly different. But we've got to make that easier. We've got to become easier to do business with. And, you know, therefore, we've got to listen to the people that we're giving this experience to. And if we can save that time, we can spend that extra time on collaborating. So it's about just shifting where our time goes. And at the moment, 50% of our time is wasted on arguing over points in the contract that we probably never resolve anyway. And we might as well spend that time on doing positive stuff. So I agree. When it comes to contracts, our industry is an absolute nightmare, and that's where all of our time goes at the moment. And we've got to react to that. And I think if one person does it, then everyone will start following, hopefully.
Yep.
And again, Steve, clients can influence that. So that's where the clients can actually set the contractual structure, and where, again, specifiers can talk about some of the models that are out there. You know, we've got integrated project insurance that exists now. Yeah, and if you've got a risk engineer from an insurance company, you look at the difference between the contract for an integrated project insurance and what we typically work to, and they force you to engage early, because they're not going to let you deal with these risks on the fly. They're going to want to put it all up and manage up front. You know, they're risk engineers, they're risk adverse, and they want to get it right first time. I mean, another, you know, we've got, if you're not going down the integrated project insurance route, you've got integrated project delivery. We've even got an acronym for it. There's an acronym, ECI, which stands for Early Contractor Involvement. You know, we've got the acronym. Let's bloody use it. And just as another point is that the other benefit of this is the pipelines. You know, the point you made earlier, Lee, was around the lack of investment in digital. Why? Why aren't we investing in some of this technology? It's because we can't. It's because every project has to wash its face, and you can't make money investing off one project. Yeah. And this contract-based project environment means, you know, if you give early engagement, you give pipeline. You allow people to invest in their workforce. You allow people to invest in their technology. You know, you could lose money on one job because you're going to make money on the next 5. And that's where the partnership approach comes in, where we can allow investment through that. But if not, what you force is contractor models, which are just living to the next project, fighting for the next project, and they will only survive as long as they've got 2 or 3 projects. I mean, we have the worst in the UK at the moment. Construction has the worst insolvency rate. You know, it's a problem, and it's a problem of our own making, and it's a problem that's forced by the contracts that we're using and our inability to move beyond that. So I think that's a really important place to start.
Cool. Tim, can we just pass that on to yourself? Obviously, the guys have just raised some really sort of valid points there. Do you see any sort of ways that you could sort of collaborate better, I suppose, with the supply chain yourself?
Well, I suppose I'm at the risk of repeating myself to some degree here. Okay. But before I do that, what I will say is we've heard from Richard mentioned about getting involved with contracts ideally before you'd like to, and that happens a lot and has happened for many years. But I think that is an area that needs to be addressed, because we're all jumping in, because we all perhaps want to get involved. We want to do what seems to be the right thing. But if it ultimately is too early to get involved, we should say, look, it's too early. There has to be a greater level of design. There has to be more details that are relevant to the specific project before we can get involved. Because that is where it appears to me that we are all coming, sometimes a lot unstuck. Sometimes it's just a small bit unstuck. But that, I think, is a big opportunity to not jump in as early as we all appear to do, because we're all wanting to do a good job. But ultimately, we jump in and we're then struggling to get it all completed in the relevant time available to the relevant level of detail and expectancy.
Sure. I suppose some of this can come down to that contact point of view. I know Steve mentioned earlier about engaging with the supply chain earlier on and having that sort of open door policy where that people can approach them and they've got all the people's contact details. Sadly, that's not always the case with a lot of sort of people in industry, and people tend to shroud their contact information. And as a supplier, I suppose one of the challenges, and it's something I've faced, I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe you've faced yourself, is that trying to get hold of the specifiers at the time to discuss certain projects and find out what's been going on. Obviously, there's avenues that can be provided there, but if you were engaged at an earlier stage, whether or not there's some design fundamentality to actually give you something to be able to quote or tender to or even work with, just having that earlier collaboration and acknowledgement that there is something in the pipeline, I suppose, would help set you up there. I think on that,
another point I would add is that we don't expect designers to know absolutely everything, but what we would like to have, and I guess this does relate to competency to some degree, and that is an acknowledgement of when they need to call for expertise to become involved. So that potentially is something that can be addressed by appropriate training.
Sure, and I think that's something obviously at MBS we've been sort of actively pushing. I think we've done quite a lot of knowledge articles recently towards the specification community and towards the supply chain, as to look, this is really where knowledge and looking at things like case studies and previous examples of work sort of starts to come in. I think at this particular point, that might be a great time to throw that sort of to Paul to get his views on it from the design point of view. Obviously, we hear a lot from the supply and the contractual side of things, but from an earlier engagement and early collaboration, we've just heard quite a few blockers there. Paul, is there anything that you can sort of shed some light on in that, or offer some opinion?
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of the Q&A that I've noticed in the chat as well that refer to this. I think there's two aspects to what we're trying to do with communication. There's the facts and design and ideas and all the things that have to be part of an audit trail of recorded decisions. And that makes absolute sense. You want to know that you can go back at any stage and indicate who did what when, and more importantly, why they made that decision. And that's the use of an audit trail. And that's why things like email have become so prolific in business.
Yep.
But it's not necessarily the same as communicating and collaborating. Actually, those two can be blockers towards that. What we also need to combine that with is an open platform and the ability for people to collaborate within that. So that, yes, of course, there'll be stages of the project where you have to have that cut-off record of what was done. But in between those two times, there has to be the culture, as we've talked about, for openness. And so much that comes down to that fear again, that fear of failure, the fear of retribution, the fear of litigation. And I think the opportunity is there for us to be more open in the design phases, the work that actually needs to be done to coordinate the things that we do, while still adhering to a good audit trail and regulatory process.
Great. Thanks very much, Paul. Just keeping a track on the time, obviously, we've just really sort of heard a lot there about there's opportunities, there's technologies that exist, but there's a lot of stubbornness and fears in a lot of cases. Going to open this up to the whole panel. Maybe Ian from FIS, if you want to sort of start off. Do we think greater collaboration is a pipe dream, or do you think it's something that's going to be achievable?
I don't think it can be a pipe dream. I think what we have to look at is some of the barriers to change. So for why every report since Alfred Law bloody Bosom in 1911 has talked about this, that we're an adversarial supply chain. So I think just started, but clients don't want to be guinea pigs, right? And that's one of the problems we have when we're too big to fail. You've got clients who don't want to be guinea pigs, but not all clients are the same. I think we have to start by looking at where public sector can lead, because they are a repeat client. We have to look at the people that do a lot of construction and start there, and then hopefully some of the best practice will filter down. People don't change because it's difficult. You know, we've got processes ingrained, we've got people ingrained, and we all need to change, as I said earlier. I mean, I think, you know, the finite business model I talked about, Steve's colleague John Waterman does a fantastic presentation if anyone wants to sort of hunt it down, about sort of the difference between a finite and infinite business model. But at the moment we operate a project-based system, and we need to move to one that enables investment, and that's important. But the mechanisms change are out there. I said there's new ways of working, and there is integrated projects insurance, which looks at how we cover the project beyond the initial construction stage. We look into the operation and management of the building, which is 40 to 80% of the cost of a building. Think about that at design stage, and ensure that the whole life cost is brought through in terms of the project, and delivered and measured through the project effectively. I know the Construction Leadership Council has done some excellent work, really, really good work around managing value through the construction process. Yeah, and that's value in its broadest sense, not just the capital cost of the construction. So I think it's not a pipe dream. It can't be a pipe dream, because 6% of world GDP is reliant on this industry performing. It's reliant on this industry, and it has to be better. Society deserves it to be better, and we all want it to be better. So no, it's not a pipe dream, but I think it's a realization that all of us have got to change and stop blaming each other.
Great. I can either point people out to sort of respond, or whether somebody wants to shout up first if they've got a response.
I've got a quick one,
Yeah.
Yili. I think when we think about, in response to what Ian said there, that often collaboration can be seen as a bit of a dilution of responsibility. You know, something has failed. I think whether it's those insurance methods, whether it's about, you know, the contractual and procurement background, we have to get away from an excuse-making, blame culture, you know, that comes up in the reviews and in all the various productivity reports about the construction industry for decades, that we have to remove that and get to a point where we can confidently make mutual decisions that will arrive at safer buildings. And that seems so fundamental to kind of underpin all of what we've talked about so far.
Great. Steve or James, possibly from a contractor's point of view, any opinions on that?
Yeah, well, I'll kind of echo what's already been said. I don't think it's a pipe dream at all, because it's happening. May not be happening exactly how we want it to at the moment, but it's already on its way. So definitely not a pipe dream, and it's a must, really. And I believe, and who knows if I'm right or wrong, but I believe that the companies that don't collaborate will eventually get left behind. I think it's as simple as that. I think we will have a shift over the next 5 to 10 years, and those that don't want to buy into it will just simply get left behind. So no, I think it's nowhere near a pipe dream. It's fundamental to our future, really.
Great. James?
Yeah, just quickly, I suppose it's like what Paul said, you know, I think people do need to look at themselves first before they point fingers. I think that's where it needs to start. You need to look at yourself and how you can be a better collaborator and see how you can engage with other people. That's sort of where it needs to start. You need to be able to do an effective, join a situation where you're expected to collaborate, and probably part of that, I do agree, sort of the way you're going to collaborate, like a method of collaboration is quite important as well, because everybody has different styles, and if you're clear about your method, then it invites it, you know, you can know where you stand from day one and where you need to improve, or where others need to improve on their method, you know.
Sure. Okay. I think at this point, Richard, do you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and pick up on one of Steve's points earlier as well, about engaging with the supply chain as well. Something that we do, which sounded similar to what Wilmot Dixon does. We have a lessons learned project debriefing. We invite the supply, you know, the head members of the supply chain to come in at the end of each project, and we literally sit down and talk through what went well, what didn't go well, what could be done better. And I think that's the way what we're looking to continue with, because I think it's important that everybody just sort of buys into the success or the failure and learns from it and doesn't let it happen again, basically.
Sure. Right, guys, we've actually got 5 minutes left. The past hour and a half has gone really, really quickly. So I think we're going to have to sort of wrap that up there a little bit. We're going to get around to some of the audience questions in a second. Paul obviously is mentioned, and Tim's mentioned some of the collaborative tools that the MBS have been providing. If anybody wants to take a look at those, please visit the mbs.com. But we've obviously got MBS Core as the new specification tool, which is actually documenting and opening up those specifications and that audit trail a lot more clearly, which is now being powered by MBS Source, which has replaced our IBA product selector recently. So there's a whole ream of things that we're doing to try and push that, and it's great to see that obviously the contractors, the designers, and the suppliers are also in the same boat to try and push that, obviously backed up by these trade associations as well. We're going to pick up some questions here. We've had quite a lot through, but I think we've got time to answer maybe a few of these. I'm going to fire this first one here to let's go to Richard on this one, I think. This is from Andrew Rees, and he's asking, is the panel scene a move away from design and build contracts back to a more traditional architect specification type scenario?
I think at the moment we're sort of finding that sort of project, they tend to be sort of 50-50 at the moment, and I'm not just saying that to sit on the fence. That is genuinely based on those opportunities that we have either in our pipeline or on site at the moment. I think the days of bills of quantities and detailed technical packs and drawings are behind us. I think a lot of what we're seeing at the moment is moving towards contractors' design portion, design and build, performance specifications, and that creates a lot of ambiguity, and it must make it difficult then for the clients and their sort of appointed team to be able to appraise the returns, because you will get so many different offerings from so many different contractors that are tendering or pitching for that scheme. The ideal scenario, in my opinion, would be that it did go back to full sort of design and specification, because at least then you have a consistent and level playing field then, and you're coming down to everybody sort of tendering for the same scheme rather than putting their own interpretation or their own spin on it, really, to meet the performance requirements.
Okay, thanks very much, Richard. We've also got another question here, and this is around the client. I'm going to sort of maybe fire this one to Steve, I think. Is the client the key contact for ensuring that specification sticks? Obviously, you guys are involved in a lot of design and build, and would take control for a lot of these kind of portions. What's your opinion on that, Steve?
No, it's our responsibility.
Yep.
That's why they're employing us. We take full responsibility for all of that. Anything that is a Wilmot Dixon project is our complete responsibility. Is that really. This is why we have to scrutinise specification to make sure that we only put products into the buildings that we're happy with. There are some times where we will ask things to change because they don't meet the standards that we've already agreed that we use. So that does happen. But again, we will never put anything to a building that we're not happy with. It's our responsibility. It's our reputation as well. So we are fully responsible.
Okay, thanks very much. And I think we've got time for one more. Paul, I'm going to sort of direct this one to yourself. We've heard about how it needs to come from the top down, and so the early engagement is the key thing, I think, that we're getting here for a better collaboration. How do we educate the client to undertake early engagement? This is a question that's coming from Al Huntley on the live panel, and I think it's something that is obviously asked quite a lot in the industry. Is what do we do there with that?
Yeah, so much of it I think comes down to the type of client and to the kind of education needs around that. The RIBA did some great work on client engagement, and often it's about understanding the process. Some are very experienced clients who've been through this hundreds of times, but more often than not, you're actually working with people who may be fairly inexperienced, having to make these decisions. So it's about education, it's about understanding how the process works, and making all the decisions as clear and as transparent as possible and right across the process.
Great. Thanks very much. Right, we've got 1 minute left, so I'm going to have to wrap up there. Just in summary, obviously, that we've had a great session. Thanks very, very much to all of the panel that have attended today and provided such a great deal of content for us. I think what we've heard mainly is collaboration is not a pipe dream. There are obviously some sort of barriers that we're going to have to overcome to get this to work, but the key message that seems to have stuck in my mind, and hopefully it has from everybody else's, is that early engagement. If we can start to engage earlier and use some of the tools that are there, then we're going to stand in good stead. But importantly, we also need to make sure that engagement is done fairly and it's done responsibly as well. So yeah, thank you very much for the panel. This event is going to be recorded, like I said, and it's going to be available on demand at thembs.com/events. Any questions that we didn't get around to answering, we'll get a response out to you by email. So thank you very much for submitting those. And until next time, we'll see you again. Thank you very much. Take care, guys.